Alright, so now we have transferred to the programming page. So let's implement our business class objective onto a program. So we want to make a class called cell phones. And this will be our little processor slash template for all our data that we extracted about cell phones from the students in our course. As we mentioned before, we need to make instance fields that represent the different characteristics of the objects, where in this case will be various types of phones. So let's declare brand, ID number, and color instance fields. So string color and int ID num. Now each object, or to be specific, each phone object, will have a copy of these instances. I'll expand on that later. So let's write that down as a reference. Since this program will help us keep track of all the different data associated with phones, we need to know how many phones were involved in this survey, and therefore we will be using a number generator. And this number generator counts how many phones are involved in the survey. The way we declare the number generator is different from all the other declarations because it's a class field. And so we would write public static int num generator equals to 1. Now we would have to write static in front of the variable type and variable name because it's a class field, and we want to assign a value of 1 to num generator because it will be an accumulative type, and I'll explain that later. And we do this because a class field is directly associated with the class rather than the particular objects. It is an individual variable and it's on its own. It has nothing to do with any of the objects. Like, the objects will not have a copy of this class field. We also want to make another class field called the number of phones. Basically, the number generator is the number of phones, but since we want to use the generator to formulate an ID number to each phone, we want a specific variable just to keep track of the number of phones. So the second purpose of the generator is to give an ID number to each phone. So each time a new object is made, the generator generates an ID number for that phone. So let's make a constructor. It'll be a basic constructor. It'll allow the user to set values to the new phone objects that are being created. So public cell phones, and then string color, string brand, let's add the braces. Okay, so this dot color is equal to the color in the brackets. This dot brand will be equal to the brand in the brackets, and the ID number will be equal to the number generator, so num generator, and the number of phones will also be equal to the num generator. And we write num generator plus plus because it's an accumulative type. We want the value of the num generator to change every time a new object is made, and that's why we make it an accumulative. So let's compile the program. Alright, it's compiled. And let's test it out. So let's go to the interactions panel. And let's make a new cell phone object and see how our class fields would work with this. So let's make an object called cellphone1 and equals to new cell phones, and let's make this phone red, and let's make the brand Apple. So basically, the num generator that is assigned a value of 1 gives this value to the ID number of this object. And now let's make our second object to see what the num generator does with that. Let's call this cellphone2, new cell phones, bracket, let's make this phone blue, and the brand BlackBerry. Alright, so since the num generator is an accumulative type, and it's allowed to be because it's a class field, it's independent. It manipulated its value to be one more than its previous value. So now that we created a new object, our num generator changes its value and assigns this new value to this object's ID number. And let's see how we would call this object with its instance. So we would type cellphone1.id number. And we get 1. And this is ID num is an instance field, and that's why we call it a certain way. We use its object name dot variable name, and that's how we would call an instance of an object. Let's call the instance ID num for cellphone2, and let's see the value of the ID num, and there we go, and it's 2, and that is because of the num generator that was in the constructor. Now say we're done our survey and we want to know how many phones were involved. So we would have to call the class field num of phones, or number of phones. And because this is a class field, we would call it differently. We would use the class name, which is cell phones, dot variable name, which is num of phones, or number of phones, and enter, and that's 2. So this program is telling us that we used 2 phones in this survey. And we got this number. Remember how we got this number? We got it from the num generator. It assigned its final value to the number of phones. And as you can see, number of phones has nothing to do with any of the objects. It's completely independent, and it's working on its own, and it's directly associated to the class, which is cell phones. And that's the end of our program. Goodbye.